Hi everyone, this is a very special module for me and hopefully for you too. I'm here at WABC Studios, and one of the assignments that you did was Quiet Hero, where you wrote a summary and then wrote a reaction and a response to the book. So I thought it would be a very special treat if I came to WABC Studios and have you meet Emmy Award winning hostess Rita Cosby. So Rita, thank you so much for doing this for my students and for me. This is such a special treat.
I'm so happy to be here, Professor DePalo, and also so happy to be here with the Fordham University students. This class is fantastic, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Great. So why don't you tell the students a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been a journalist for more than 20 years. Television, also doing radio. We're here at the WABC studios as we speak.
Yes, we are.
And also a writer as well, and someone who's covered a lot of difficult stories. I've covered also entertainment stories and a mixture, as everybody does in broadcast news, but spent a lot of time also in war zones, covered Hurricane Katrina, have seen, a number of different situations, hostage crisis, interviewed Yasser Arafat in the Middle East when his compound was being bombed, and felt I had covered a lot of difficult, tough stories as a journalist, and a wide variety of stories too as well.
Great. So let's get to this story, Quiet Hero, and let's get back to that Christmas Day. What happened that Christmas Day?
That Christmas Day was probably one of the most difficult times of my life. I was a teenager, and I was in the bathroom. I remember, putting on makeup. It's holidays. You're thinking, of course, all the wonderful things in your family. And I heard my parents arguing in the other room. And I heard my father say, "I'm leaving." And I thought he was leaving work, because he said it so nonchalantly and very cool and very calmly, like it was no big deal. And the next thing I learned, he was leaving us, and he was leaving our family very abruptly. And when he came in to tell me, it was as if he was just, ordering a pizza. By the way, I'm leaving. And my mother was stunned, my brother was stunned, I was stunned. And I always wondered, who was this man? Who was my father? And from that moment on, my father was basically not a part of my life. And here I continued as a journalist covering all these stories and covering wars, and not knowing there was this incredible story in my own family.
Right. So you felt a disconnect from him?
Yeah, very much a disconnect. And what was the most difficult thing, I think, as a teenager, as a young person too, suddenly your father comes in, and I thought life was good. I think my mother thought life was good. And what surprised me was how cold my father was and how detached he was. And, if they were having problems in the marriage or he was having problems in life, he didn't even really give an explanation.
Right.
And he didn't seem affected that he was not just leaving a wife of 32 years, who was a good wife, and they didn't seem to have really too many problems. He was leaving a family. And it didn't seem to affect him that it would affect us. And I always wondered, why was my father so numb and so sort of nonchalant about clearly a very traumatic, suddenly your father is no longer a part of your life, and my mother was devastated, my brother and I were devastated. And I always wondered, who was this man? Who was my father? What was going on in his mind that he could just seemingly leave a family like it was nothing?
Right. So there was a sense of depersonalization, a sense of dissociation, the numbness that basically he was projecting onto the family.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And here we were, we were in Greenwich, Connecticut at the time. I mean, life was good, but suddenly your father leaves you. It's devastating as a child. And the fact that he was so impersonal about it, and so impersonal to my mother as well. And I don't think my parents ever spoke again after that Christmas Day. And my contact with my father was extremely limited after that Christmas Day. I didn't feel I knew this man.
Right. So let's fast forward. Now you are a successful broadcaster, and you come upon a suitcase in a storage room. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and Professor DePalo, that changed my life. Fast forward many years after that Christmas Day, and my mother had passed away. My mother raised my brother and myself. And I grew up in a loving home. My mother was a very different person than my father, so I felt like I had love in the home, but I always missed my dad and was confused about my dad. And after my mother passed away, who really was my mother and my father, she took the role of both. My brother and I were very devastated at the loss. We put all her items in a storage locker. And then just a few years ago, here it is decades later, we go to the storage locker, and inside, just looking at the storage locker, I saw in the corner this old tan battered leather suitcase. And I had never seen it before. And just looking at it, it looked unusual. And I walked over to it and I opened it up. And inside was my father's life. I found this rusty POW tag emblazoned with the words Stalag 4B, and it had prisoner number 305147 emblazoned on it. And then I found this bloody red and white fighting Polish armband, and I could tell it had been used, and it was dirty and had blood on it as well. And then I found a card of an ex-POW named Ryszard Kozabutsky. And I'm Rita Cosby. I knew my father was Polish. I knew my father had been a resistance fighter and had something to do with the war, but that was it. And when I saw this, I realized, oh my gosh, this is my father. And then I went home and I looked at the POW tag. Here I am, a journalist who's covered wars, and I've interviewed prisoners of war. I've been in very difficult situations, but this was something personal. And I looked online and I realized, oh my gosh, this is a POW tag. And I looked up Stalag 4B, and it said one of the most notorious POW camps, Nazi POW camps in World War II. And then I saw this line, and it said, if the POW tag is together with a perforation, a duplicate on the top and the bottom, that means that the inmate survived. Because the Nazis would break the tag in half, and if you died or you were tortured or whatever happened or starved to death, they'd tag your foot or put a tag in your mouth, and the rest would go in the Nazi record books. They were very meticulous with records, but if it was together, it meant the inmate survived. And when I saw that line, I thought, oh my gosh, I have not had my father in my life for decades. But whatever pain I had, not having my father in my life is so minor compared to someone who was a Nazi prisoner of war and survived. And I thought, I need to forgive this man. I was older, I was an adult now. I'd covered wars, I had seen the effects certainly on many other people. But I thought, I need to find my father and I need to forgive him, and that's what I did.
And how did you find him? How did you start the search?
Well, I used my journalistic skills. All those years of work came in handy.
Great.
And I did some tracking down. I touched base with relatives. I had a sense of where he was. But he had a new family.
Oh, wow.
He had really moved on. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to call him and I'm going to set up a meeting. And when I finally tracked him down and reconnected with him, and I came with a very non-accusatory tone. I think we would not have reconnected if I had called and said, hey, Dad, why'd you leave the family? Why'd you do this to us? And I think I would have had, obviously, a right to, given it was devastating. We were the child. I was the child and my brother was the child. We were the children. But I came with a real loving heart when I approached my dad. And I think because I was mature enough to be able to say, gosh, I need to walk in this man's shoes. And clearly what he went through was so devastating, so traumatic, and survived. How could it not affect his family and affect anything that he did there on out?
You share something so key in social work is walking in someone's shoes, and that's empathy. And you came across to your father as very empathic.
Yes.
And you just wonder, how is it that he held on to this secret for so long? Like, why didn't you just share the secret? Did that ever go through your mind?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I had the chance to ask him.
Okay.
Because when I reconnected with my dad, at first, my first seeing him, I hadn't seen him in years. I mean, it was almost a stranger, basically, seeing. So there was a lot of reconnection. And then I said, Dad, I want to know who you are. I want to know who I am. And I asked my dad, you know, why didn't you ever share this story when he started to finally share the story? And he said, you know, two things. One, he said, you know, you had asked a few times when you were a child, what's this, or what are the scars, or what are these things? And he said, I thought it was too painful to share with the child. And two, he said, it was too traumatic for me. I was not ready. And he said, it was so horrible what I went through. And he said, and I became so numb because of what I saw. I had to block out some of the things I saw. And he talked about specific moments too.
Like what?
One of the most dramatic, and my father, as it turns out, when he started to share this story, I learned of this incredible secret past that my father had and that so many people have who go through, whether it's war trauma or different traumas.
Right.
But in my father's case, he was a teenager when the Nazis invaded. And he decided to stay and fight and become a full-blown resistance fighter voluntarily, because he's not Jewish, he's Polish Catholic, and decided to stay and fight. And I went from, you know, obviously angry and confused at this man to saying, gosh, this man really was heroic and had incredible moral substance. And my father at one point escaped through the sewers, escaping from the Nazis, then was taken to a POW camp at gunpoint, almost dying from a mortar shell, stumbling, and his city was in rubble, shoved onto a boxcar, not knowing where he was going to end up. And then he's taken to a German POW camp and escaped at 90 pounds and 6 feet tall. My dad was part of a big escape from a camp. Some were recaptured and killed. And my dad was ultimately rescued by American troops, and that's why he came to America. And my dad talked about one of these incredible moments. And one of the things we actually saw firsthand, we went back to Poland together. But
when did you do that?
We did that as we were working on the book. What we decided to do, we did a book together. And when I heard the story, I thought, gosh, not only did I want to go on this incredible journey with my dad, and it was wonderful to go through with the book. It was, you know, it sort of forced both of us to really get detailed, and my dad was so excited to go on this journey and share the story with me and others. But when I heard it, I said, gosh, I have to share this story because it will encourage other people to break through and to share their stories and talk therapy. I didn't realize I was sort of playing psychiatrist and psychologist and being a talk therapist. I just did as a journalist, asking questions, and also as a loving daughter, wanting to know this man. But what my dad shared with me this one moment when we went back to Poland and retracing the steps that he went through and seeing Poland through his eyes, and imagine how traumatic. This is like the guys who go back to Vietnam. And to see the last time he saw again his city was in rubble. Part of his town was 87% destroyed. He was dying and almost all his friends were dead. And he took me to this place where he said he lost all emotion. And I think it's where I got my father back. I know it's where I got my father back. He told me in the middle of the Warsaw Uprising, he's a teenager fighting. And he said that at one point all his unit hopped on this tank and they were so excited to seize a German tank. And the Polish resistance guys were so outgunned by the Nazis. It was really a David and Goliath fight. They had no weapons, they were outmanned, they had no place to live. Their city and country was being obliterated. And so suddenly they seized this German tank. It was like a windfall. It was so exciting to these young soldiers. And so my father's unit hopped on the tank and said, hey, come on the tank and let's parade around town and show it off that we've gotten this German tank. My dad said no, and thought a little, there's something kind of fishy about it. And my father walked away and the tank exploded. And he felt the ground shake. And my father said he ran back and literally saw rivers of blood. And here he is, a teenager in the middle of fighting for his country. And he said his girlfriend couldn't even find a trace. He had a small gun. He was one of the few people. The gun was gone. She was gone. All his unit was gone. As it turned out, 500 people were killed when that tank exploded. And they believe it was probably booby-trapped or something by the Nazis. And my father said when he came back and saw this absolutely horrific scene, and here he was in the middle of the fighting, he said he remembered saying to himself, I need to block this out because it's so horrible what I'm seeing. and I need to fight even more ferociously in their honor, and I need to keep fighting because now I've lost all these people. I need to continue the fight even more rigorously and more patriotically because I need to do it so their lives weren't in vain. And he said, at that moment, I said, I have to block it out. I have to become numb. And when my father and I went back to the scene of where the tank exploded, I had no idea of how traumatic it was. My father just collapsed. Here was this man who was so steel most of my life, and he just bawled. And when I saw my dad just weep, and he said, and I'm so sorry. He said, because that's the way I was with you when I left you. And he said, you know, when I saw all these rivers of blood and saw these things, I said, I have to become numb. I have to block it out. And I'm sorry, because that's how I was as a father. And from that moment on, first of all, how could I not forgive my father? And at that moment on, I had my dad back. I said, I understand.
And can you imagine all those years of holding in the tears? And it took that moment for that release to occur for him as well as for you.
And obviously still very emotional for me now, today.
Oh, but it's...
but tears of joy, too, because I realized at that moment, how traumatic. And here it was in my father's case, the trauma he was holding in literally for 65 years. It was almost 65 years to the day that that tank exploded when we walked in the scene. And my father said, I've never wept over this. I never, you know, I'm so glad I finally can let these emotions out. And I'm so glad I can say I'm sorry, too, because I realized that, you know, I left you abruptly. And in his mind, he thought, oh, he's leaving a family in beautiful, cushy Greenwich, Connecticut. There are no bombs going off. There's no war going on. And almost the same age, my father was basically a prisoner of war. And so that was his benchmark. So he thought, oh, they have it pretty good, not realizing where's our dad suddenly and how could we not be confused and angry by what we felt. And I think my father's case so aptly doesn't just show the emotions that one person can carry on for decades, but also the effects on family too.
Yes. It's interesting because probably there's also survivor guilt.
Oh, absolutely. And in my father's case, 80 to 90% of his unit did not survive. And my father saw so many people, in that case, so many of his friends gone in an instant. And at one point early on in the war, this commander, this Lieutenant Stan, who was sort of his mentor and his idol, was killed, almost died in his arms, basically. And you think of that effect that has on someone. And my father did feel very guilty as to why was he the lucky one to make it out. Why did he get through? And why did so many wonderful people that he loved, why did they lose their lives? And my father thought, why not him? And I think in so many times he wished he could have traded because he loved so many of his comrades, especially when, you're in such a close-knit thing as height of battle, where you literally would give your life for somebody and watch his back, and to do all of that and then suddenly lose them and see them dying literally all around you. And my father's still a teenager at this point. I mean, all of these things happened before the age of 18.
So in a way of survival for him, he had to, in order to cope, dissociate, depersonalize, in order to move forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in many ways, it was maybe an admirable thing at the time, because when he was in the middle of battle, probably be the fact that he could steel himself. Because he said at that moment when he came to the scene of the tank explosion, he said, I knew, as he was recounting it to me many decades later, he said, I knew there were two choices. He said, I can just collapse in the horror of what I'm seeing here and not even be able to function, or I could steel myself and just block this off. And he said, that's what I chose to do. And he said, and that's the way I tried to handle myself when he was taken prisoner. And when he was in that POW camp, he said he tried to really, and so many people were dying around him even before he got to the camp. And he said, well, I knew I couldn't get too close to people because they may not be there the next day. And it was interesting because now I look back, even when some of the very happy times when I was a child with my dad was always very gregarious with friends and different people, but if it came to anything personal, he couldn't talk about it. Right. He could never deal with sort of anything that was personal or interpersonal, and wasn't very interpersonal whatsoever with me or my brother or my mom, but he could talk to the neighbor just fine. And I think much of that was just because of what he went through.
So at that moment when he collapsed and he bawled and cried, it sounds as if it was very cathartic for him, but at that moment he also was able to repersonalize, reassociate, and how beautiful he was able to do it with his daughter.
Oh, thank you. And you know what? I feel like it was cathartic for me too. It was really a healing moment for both of us.
Wow.
And it was so dramatic, Professor DePalo, that after that moment he just hugged me and he kept saying, "I'm so sorry. I tried to do the best I could." And you realize he probably did do the best he could, given what he went through.
Right.
And it really allowed me to understand and have such sympathy for what he went through. And now I look back and say, now I look almost back in amazement. You know, there were so many decades where I was angry and confused and so puzzled at who was this man and how could he just disassociate. And at that moment I realized, oh my gosh, the fact he was even able to function after that moment, and then met my mother and they came to America. And to have a successful career and 2 healthy kids, and obviously wasn't a perfect father, but the fact he even was able to function at all is really quite remarkable.
You know, the story reminds me of Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
And what specifically stands out for me is how your father transcended the suffering and how he was able to move forward. It's amazing where he got that strength from.
It is amazing. And you know, my father took it to such an extreme. And I think that's why it's been such an interesting, story in terms of my father. Here he was going through such incredible trauma. And to block it out, my father not only, did he emotionally block it out, as soon as he was rescued by American troops, my father and his fellow POWs shook hands and said, "We will never talk about the past again.
Wow.
We will only talk about the future. Our lives start now. Now we are free after this horrible trauma that they endured for many years of Nazi occupation and then the POW camp and everything they went through." He said, "We made it. We will now our lives start. This is the beginning. We will never," they almost made it, they physically made a pact and shook hands. And then my father, moved forward. He continued a little bit in the Polish Second Corps, which is part of the British Army, met my mother, came to America, and when he became an American citizen, he changed his name. He was Ryszard Kozabucki, freedom fighter, and then came over to America and became Richard Cosby. Barely spoke Polish until we, rejuvenated this whole moment, and he would talk, and went back to Poland, but really blocked it out. And I'm really convinced that he took it to such an extreme, but did that as a survival mechanism.
Yes.
It was suddenly Richard Cosby, American civil engineer, father for some time with us, and father with a new family, but tried to psychologically, and that was his way of coping, and really took it to an ultimate level of changing his name and becoming a new nationality and so many different things, but that was all a defense mechanism, I think, as well.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting because writing this book, in my profession, we talk about a therapeutic alliance and we talk about getting into someone's narrative and working through. This book, you managed to process on your own and you worked through some of your own grief. The loss that you experienced as a 13-year-old, right? Like what happened? And you managed to do that. Where did you get your strength from?
Well,
because I don't think this was easy to write.
Oh, it was so emotional. And I feel like when I talk about strength, I feel like I thought I was a pretty strong person, but nothing compared to my father, obviously. I think my father's strength is amazing now. I have such incredible respect and appreciation. But I think some of it was my life experience. I think because I had been to places where I've seen people lose so much and seen how it's affected them, as a journalist, I've covered, you know, people who've had tremendous losses, who've lost their families or lost their homes, and seen the grief on their faces and how they've coped and how difficult it's been for them. And I think that gave me some empathy. I think also I was old enough to be able to appreciate it. I was at the point, and I hope my story inspires other people, because I was at the point where if my father was not ready to receive me, when I called my dad, it's funny, here I've interviewed all these, you know, I've spent time talking to Arafat and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. I've talked to dictators and, you know, some very difficult people. And yet I was so nervous calling my dad. My hands were sweating. I was so nervous. But I also was ready that if my dad was not ready to receive me and said, you know, Rita, we have nothing to talk about, I was okay with that. It would have been hard, but I was also doing it for closure for me. Closure. And I thought, at least I can say I tried. Mm-hmm. And I was at a place, I think, maybe given that I was a little older, and I was at a place to be able to receive whatever it was. I was happy that my dad accepted it, and I was happy, I think also, I didn't realize at the time that it was sort of playing therapist, because I genuinely was a daughter seeking to find her dad at that point, and to get to know who he was.
So much of this is the working through, and working through in treatment is a lot of work, and it stirs up a lot of emotion, and you did it by way of sublimation and by writing and journaling, and you allowed us into your narrative. And what a beautiful, beautiful story this is. The response I usually get from students is they want to try to reach out to someone because this book is so inspirational and so hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. And you know what, I feel like I think about, gosh, when that suitcase came, and I knew almost right away I had two choices. I could have just closed the suitcase and said, oh, this is interesting, and here are, you know, continue with my career, and I was doing okay and successful and all that. But it doesn't matter how successful or things you have, if you're missing a part of your life, and if there's someone who you feel disconnected to, you're not complete. And I knew the other alternative was right away to forgive my dad. And it took a few seconds. It wasn't like, okay, I'm going to forgive him. It was, you know what? My mother's gone. I still have a parent who's alive. And clearly he went through something so horrible and so horrific that I do need to reach out. And, you know, it's interesting, in the book, I talk about my father leaving, and I showed my dad the book. Take a look at this before it gets published. And it has the good, the bad, and the ugly in there. Okay. And I was a little nervous when I sent it to him. I said, I want you to read the final draft before it gets published. If there's something wrong or something, you know, you want to change, you let me know. And he stayed up all night and read it. He got it, I think he got it like 5 o'clock, and he called me at 9 or 10 in the morning, and he was angry and said, I'm really angry at something in the book. And I thought, oh no, he's not going to be, maybe he didn't come full circle as I thought he had. You know, maybe, you know. I didn't know if he would be comfortable with the leaving the family, because I thought that was very courageous of him to talk about too. It's not always easy for guys or anybody to talk about something as difficult as that. And he said, I'm angry about one thing. He said, everything's correct except one thing, the title. You called me a hero. He said, I am not a hero. He said, the guys who died, those guys are heroes. The guys who rescued me, those guys are heroes. The American troops who hugged me and said, you're free, those are the heroes. He said, other than that, the book is correct. And I said, are you okay with it? And he said, yes, because I think it will help other families. And you and I are best friends now. And I'm so thankful for that. And it's the truth. And I think it will inspire other families too. And I hope that that's the case.
Oh, that is
so
so
I thought that was courageous of him.
That is so great. It's selfless, right?
Yes.
It sounds like your dad.
Yeah, putting yourself out there. And for a guy who was very closed and very steel, when he walked in that Christmas Day and told me the news, boy, did we come full circle from that to saying, I hope it helps other people. And my dad was a different person too. What I think's been the greatest blessing through all of this is I've even addressed the Pentagon and talked about post-traumatic stress to what happens to the warrior and families. And my dad, after we left that trip to Poland and after he confronted his fears, and I told my father that of all the things he's done, you know, fighting certainly was extremely heroic. Surviving a Nazi POW camp is certainly heroic.
Yes.
But I really felt it was so deeply heroic, too, that he was willing to go back to Poland. And he was nervous. I had met the president of Poland while I was doing the book, and he invited us. And I knew my father was not going to be jumping up to go back because it was facing his fears. He had not been back since he was held at gunpoint and shoved on that boxcar as a teenager. And here he is at that point in his 80s. And I said to my father, I said, Dad, would you like to spend Thanksgiving with me? And he said, oh, that'd be beautiful, as we're doing the book.
That's so great.
And I said, would you like to spend Thanksgiving in Warsaw, Poland? And I heard dead silence on the other end of the phone. It was like a child. And I said, Dad, you need to go back. And he said, I know I do. He said, I want to know who survived. And I said, the president's invited you. Your country wants to see you. Right. It's a different country now, Dad. It's thriving. You need to see that image, not the burning rubble that you left. And he said, I know. And he said, would you go with me? And I said, yeah, let's do it together. He said, okay, I'll go back if we do it together. But I thought it was incredibly heroic of my dad to go back and face his fears and face these images. And of course, my dad at every turn, saw what it was, but also saw a smile on his face at the end of the trip because he was able to see now the country is thriving and the people were thriving. And so many people in that country were saying, thank you for what you did. They knew who my father was. They knew he was a Warsaw upriser, one of the few who survived. And my father, when he saw the young people appreciate what he did in the history and appreciate his comrades especially, I think he realized that there was value to what he did and that it meant something. And my father at the end of his life said, I would fight for my country all over again. It was my finest hour. And after he left there, he had such joy in his heart because he was able to close the circle and have a happy face at Poland now suddenly and feel joy about it as opposed to envisioning the nightmares.
You know what's so beautiful also is you gave your father the opportunity to reminisce. And with reminiscence, you allowed your father to validate his meaning and purpose in life, to validate his transcendence, to validate his belongingness. And that's what came across also. He became a person again. He became whole again. And that's what comes across in the book, and it's so beautiful.
And it's interesting because I know at the end, and my father passed away about 2 years.
Bring that up, yes.
Yeah, 2 years after the book.
Right.
But how great that he was able to see that and able to know he made a difference. And I think, to your point, Professor, one of the most beautiful things was here when my father was unfortunately in the hospital bed. He had cancer at the end of his life. And I'm so glad he was healthy enough to go back to Poland. I'm so glad we didn't wait. I'm so glad I didn't wait when I found the suitcase. I'm glad we didn't wait to go back to Poland because he was so joyous and happy. And even at the end of his life, I remember him being in the hospital room, and we saw these almost every day when I'd go visit him, I'd see, a father with his son or a mother with her daughter, whoever it was, or a doctor coming in saying, oh, I read your book. You got to hear what this guy went through. You got to see this guy is a hero and his comrades, and this reminds you of why we are Americans and what a great country. And my father, when he'd see these young kids come in, had tears in his eyes because he knew he was giving back and honoring his country and honoring American troops who rescued him. And he didn't care about the attention on himself. He cared that they were getting the attention. And I could see that my father was so happy that at the end of his life, he made a difference. And he was able to give back. And I feel like my father died a very happy man. And for the two of us, there was nothing left unsaid. And that was a great relief for me, too, as a daughter.
Right. Something I know that the audience doesn't know is that I know you were with your father all throughout his illness and until his death.
I was.
And that's commendable. And
it's beautiful. There was probably no closer daughter or father at the end, too, after going from where we literally were strangers in that time.
You didn't allow him to die alone.
Thank you.
And that took a lot of courage, and that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. And it's something beautiful too. My father, literally, on his last breath, I was holding his hand, and he opened his eyes and kind of smiled and saw the big poster of the book there we had, and we had American flags in the hospital rooms and the Polish flags, and he looked up, and I feel like he was, dreaming of the wonderful times we shared together, and I'm happy to know that was his last image. And my brother was also holding his hand.
Your brother was there as well.
Yeah, my brother was there as well. So what a beautiful moment for the two of us, and he knew, he was loved,
yes.
And we felt loved too, which was a good feeling. No regrets.
I can't thank you enough for sharing your beautiful story and your narrative with us, and the inspiration, and for giving us the opportunity to know your dad. What a gift we all received. So thank you so, so much. And I know how busy you are and the time you've given us for this interview with your hectic schedule. I'm so, so grateful. And what the audience doesn't also know is you're a great humanitarian, and you're doing such great work for the troops and for so many people that you don't talk about. But you are an inspiration, and just thank you so, so much for giving me the gift of you and your dad, and your friendship. It means so much to me. Just thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be with you, and an honor to share this story, because I hope it inspires, because when you realize how far apart my father and I were, and how difficult and extraordinary, talk about the trauma, the extenuating circumstances, I hope it gives everybody out there hope that they can bridge the gap, because literally at the very end of my father's life, which I shared, we were so close. We were best of friends. And I'm glad I broke through, and I hope it inspires others to do the same. I hope there's some nugget in here that will help inspire other people, and I love what you do, and I love the students and the classes you're doing, so it's an honor to be a part of this.
Oh, thank you so, so much.